thank you for joining us. This is an international webinar of the International Energy Agency's Task 28 on the social acceptance of wind energy projects. And we're happy you've joined us for presentations about this topic in 4 different countries. The presentations will be followed by a question and answer period, so we hope that we leave enough time for that. My name is Suzanne Kagan, and I'm with the National Renewable Energy Lab. And along with my colleague Joe Rand from the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, we will facilitate this conversation. Both of our laboratories are U.S. Department of Energy labs, and we are grateful to them for their sponsorship. During this webinar, if you have questions, you can type them into the participant feedback box on your screen. On mine, it's in the lower left. So you can just type the questions in that Q&A box. And also the slides and this recording will be available after the webinar on our Task 28 website. And the International Energy Agency Task 28 is a group of experts on the social acceptance of wind energy. We get together a couple of times a year and share the latest research on this topic. So if you're interested in it, I would encourage you to check out the website, and you'll also have the emails from the participants and the speakers in the website if you're interested in particular topics. And just to set the context for the webinar, this is a global view of offshore wind installations. So you can see on the left the rapid increase in offshore wind projects since about 2009. So in the last 10 years, offshore wind installations have really taken off. And on the right, we're showing that most offshore wind projects are currently in Europe. You can see that with the pie chart there. And these graphics are from the 2018 Offshore Wind Technologies Market Report put out by the U.S. Department of Energy, and there's a link there at the bottom if people are interested in seeing that report. The report also has a projection, and you can see that on the right-hand side of this slide for the global cumulative capacity. You can see where that line is there in 2019, where we are today, and what is projected. And so far, social acceptance, which is the acceptance of a community, or usually the acceptance of the local people for something to happen, so a project to happen. And for offshore wind, this is has been a new technology in the past 10 years or so, as you saw with those installations. So we've got stories from Europe, and now we're installing more in Asia, and we've got just one project in the U.S. But we are seeing that local communities have differing opinions on the social acceptance of these projects. And so this is just to talk about why this topic is important. The siting of these projects still involves local decision processes in many places. And if we build a technology that nobody likes in the community, it usually doesn't get installed. There are protests and that type of thing. And there have been many innovations. The turbines are getting bigger, they're getting taller, they're getting farther offshore. So these all help with some of those issues. But the most challenging pieces, when you talk to developers, they'll tell you that challenging pieces are not only the logistics, but the human pieces, right? The decision-making processes. And I've listed some of the social acceptance challenges there on the left. And then just wanted to say that as we install more renewable energy closer to people and animals, and in areas that haven't been developed yet, the social acceptance issues will increase. And offshore wind is one of the solutions to that issue, because with offshore wind, we're often near a population load, but we're not so close that people have the turbines in their backyard, which tends to be better. And you'll hear that from our speakers. And speaking of our speakers, we have really great presentations for you today. We will first hear from Jeremy Firestone, who is at the University of Delaware, followed by Gundula Hübner from Germany at the Martin Luther University in Halle. And then we'll hear from Patrick Devine-Wright from the UK at the University of Exeter. And we have a pre-recorded webinar from Yasushi from Japan, and it's midnight for him, so we didn't want to keep him up, but we did pre-record his webinar for you, and we'll be able to hear that one as well. So I will yield the presenter here, presenter controls back, and we'll hear from Dr. Jeremy Firestone.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's great to participate on this great panel with my colleagues, and I thank LBL and NREL and IEA. So, as stated, I'm from the University of Delaware here in the United States. We've just basically barely got our toes in the water. We have 30 megawatts, 5 wind turbines, but we've got grand ambitions here on the East Coast of 20,000 megawatts. We're talking from North Carolina on the south up to Massachusetts in the north. So we've been working on social acceptance of offshore wind since 2003. We started with some interviews with the very contentious Cape Wind project off of Cape Cod. We branched into surveys, and we've done national surveys, local surveys, focused on coastal tourism and on smaller projects and on commercial scale projects since then. So just a sort of quick order of play. I'm going to go over the survey structure, talk about support and opposition over time, energy transition, cable shore connection, beach tourism, process fairness, and place, fit, and appearance. So just sort of a quick whirlwind tour, as I said. So we've tended to use outcome questions in the form that you see here, asking people whether they've formed an opinion or not, whether they support or oppose or haven't yet made up their mind, and then to ask them which way they're leaning. We do this because most of our work has been at the pre-project stage, and at time it's more akin to a vote rather than, in our view, rather than attitudinal. It's really important with offshore work, particularly when you don't have a project to do, to present very realistic simulations of what a project is going to look like, and to instruct survey respondents how far to hold a mail survey or how far to be from a screen, depending on the size of the image. Just like when you go to the eye doctor, if you bring those things really up close, it's quite easy to see. Further away, not so much. So we've done, as I said, surveys over time, and it seems like Gundala is going to talk about some longitudinal aspects as well. This wasn't longitudinal in the sense that we asked different respondents, but it's all here in the state of Delaware at 4 points in time over the course of about a decade. It's important as well to think about discrete populations. The state is important because that's the policy hub, but we're also going to want to understand how ocean communities think about this, and so we use census data to figure out who lives near the ocean, and then obviously who have ocean views may have different opinions as well. You can see in Delaware there is some divergence, although there's been strong support going back to 2006, and in general stronger support over the course of the decade. It's also, I think, useful to think about offshore wind as part of the energy transition. We've asked in a number of surveys whether, assuming that the project that's near you is going to be the first, but it was the first of many, in this case 300 similar large-scale projects, so that it was not a one-off but really part of an energy transition, would you be more likely to support or oppose? We asked these of supporters, opponents, and those who've not yet made up their mind. And here I'm just presenting data on people who hadn't yet made up their mind. So Cape and Islands is off of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. DE is Delaware, my state. People who live near the ocean or statewide. And you can see in all cases, people seem, at least in the U.S., to be out in front of the politicians who are lagging quite far behind the population in wanting to see an energy transition. Transmission is really key. I think it's really sort of an understudied area in the offshore wind space, but it's really where projects really come home to roost. And coastal communities don't think like developers. So there was a public meeting back, I don't know, 6-7 years ago in Delaware. There was the developer Blue Water Wind. There was a public meeting. There was a reporter there, and the developer was discussing wanting to bring cables in through this coastal community, Bethany Beach, and they were also discussing coming in under a state park that's adjacent to the town. And the developer said, we have that alternative, but we think it's good for you folks and us to find the most efficient route. Now, if you were in front of me, I'd say raise your hands on how many think that people who live near the coast are thinking about the most efficient route from the perspective of the developer. And indeed, what we find is that there's actually concern over risk. And risk actually, in this case, relates a lot to whether people have knowledge of existing subsea cables or not. Now, in the U.S., most of those existing subsea cables are either telecommunication or internet, but we do see this large divide between knowledge and lack of knowledge. As well, then skipping to the bottom of this slide, we asked people where they would prefer the cables to come ashore, and similar to the previous slide, we see that natural areas are significantly preferred, maybe counterintuitively, over habited areas. And then we also find that people would prefer an offshore backbone transmission system as compared to multiple cables with each project individually bringing their cables ashore. We can't forget beach tourists. They're quite important. This slide discusses miles. I'll convert into kilometers. And here we ask people whether they thought turbines off the coast would make their experience better or worse. You can see most people are indifferent, but as we reach 15 miles, which is 24 kilometers, we see that 16% say it would make it better, 16% say it would make it worse. Ultimately, we want to know more than better or worse, but whether it would change behavior. And we see that, again, around this 24-kilometer line, we start to fall into pretty small single-digit percentages of people who say they wouldn't go to that beach, they'd go to another beach, or they'd stay home. But we have to also think about the flip side. That is, how many people on their last beach trip, if there were wind turbines at an adjacent beach, would instead have traveled to that adjacent beach? And we generally find, without regard to distance, about 2 to 3% would go to a different beach. So this is a form of trip gain. Another form of trip gain is curiosity trips. Oh, I would have gone to the movie, or I would have gone bowling, but oh, there's this offshore wind project. Let's go and take a look and see what that looks like instead. So that's another part of the trip gain. The last thing I'm going to focus on is our one project. That's the Block Island project off of coastal Rhode Island. I'll show you a map in a minute about sort of where that is. But as you can see in the center up at the top, it's a island community. It's a tourist community. There's a lot of boating going on, and then you can see sort of in the pictures in the upper left and in the lower center that there are some very nice bluffs as well on this island, which somewhat distinguishes it from most of the beaches on the East Coast, which are pretty flat. So here on the right, you can see the survey, the map, and up to the right on the upper is Massachusetts, and then down to the left is the tip of Long Island, New York. We did 3 surveys, longitudinal, so we kept asking the same people. Post-foundation, but pre-turbine was the first one. Then we did one post-commissioning, and then a year later. And we surveyed both island residents who live about 5 kilometers and the coastal residents who live about 26. Both pre-installation and 1 year later, we find higher support, sort of somewhat perhaps counterintuitively, people close by on the island. The 5 kilometer folks are more supportive. It could be because before they had diesel generation, they also got a cable connection to the mainland. So they got some other benefits. But in both cases, with both Block Islanders and coastal Rhode Island residents, we see an increase once they've had an opportunity to live with the wind turbines. We also wanted to understand how people felt about process, and so we asked them the effective process on their decision. And we see the biggest jump, really the biggest influence on decision was with the local residents on the island, and that being trust of the developer. So developers have a lot of control. In this case, the developer had a community liaison, a member of the community who had lived there for many years before, and I think that helped quite a bit. Lastly, I'm going to just talk about our focus on appearance, fit, and place. So appearance is, do you like the way the project looks? Then we also ask people to describe it. Is it industrial, or are there more socially constructed meanings that Patrick would talk about? And so we're talking about, is it symbolic of clean energy progress? Would it result in an intangible loss where all you see is the ocean? Does it detract from the coastal character? We asked about place attachment, identity, and dependency. As well, we asked about place meaning, solitude, family bonding, and then ultimately, is the project consistent with place meaning? So what did we find? Well, the turbine descriptors are the most important. Whether one likes the way a project looks and its perceived fit is more important than the place-related metrics. Place meanings have some influence, and neither distance to the ocean nor primary nor secondary residence are significant. And with that, thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeremy. So next we have Dr. Gundula Hübner presenting. Gundula, take it away.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Well, this is Gundula Hübner from Germany. No, I just can pick up what Jeremy said, so I'm from Germany. And I will now present some results on longitudinal studies that have been conducted in the Netherlands and in Germany by my team and me, and colleagues from several universities and other institutions. And we find similar results to the ones that Jeremy has just presented, and I think that's also for itself interesting. So we see some consistencies there. Just as the same results were found by the Dutch study, I would like to concentrate on what we did here in Germany. And I just would like to address your attention to the interviews we did. It was quite large, quite long interviews, and we also did it for 3 times. That is, during the construction of offshore wind turbines, and then 2 times after the construction. I'm going to present the results from the years 2009 and 2011 because from 11 to 12 we didn't find larger changes. And also I would like to draw your attention to the research design here in the first line. That is, we had these areas where we had this offshore farms under construction, and we had control regions that are comparable coastal line regions in Germany where it was for sure no wind farms are going to be built. And this is very important because if we find any changes in the regions where we do have wind farms, we have to know whether this change is really due to the wind farms or not to overall societal development. So that's why we are having these control regions in our research. And now I just go to show you a very few selected results on the resident side. So we ask residents and tourists and also experts, but I think that's beyond the possibility today to talk about everything. So now concentrate on the attitudes, the residents living at the coast, really in the area very close to the coast, region close to the coast. And so we asked them whether they liked, how they appreciated the offshore wind or not, And so this is it ranges from -3, I don't like them at all, I object them, up to 3. I think it's positive, I agree with it. And what you can see here are the averages from the residents we asked here in the region of Borkum, Norderney, so that's in the North Sea, the area where 2 wind farms were under construction. And this is the region, the DAS is the region from the Baltic Sea. And what you can see is that overall the far shore offshore wind turbines were evaluated more positive. Far shore means they are outside the 12-mile zone. That is, they are about 20 kilometers far away from the shore, so they are not visible, you can say. The nearshore are inside the 12-mile zone, and they were about 12 kilometers away from the shore. They were visible under very good weather conditions, and you can see here that they are on average still evaluated positively, but not as positively as the far shore or not visible offshore wind farms. And this is also a consistent result also from other studies. And what we see here is that from the year 2009 to 2011, we did not find changes concerning the major concern, and that was maritime safety. And this is of very special interest for regions that have a lot of tourism, like the German coastal lines do have. Because if anything happens with the boat, with the ship, and you have oil on the beach, it will be damaged for years. So for them, this was the most important concern. And we see that although they have this experience now, and although in the case of the DAS, the attitudes became more positive over time, we don't have a change in the concerns of maritime safety. And we talked to the people in deep interviews and workshops, and they said they are very much afraid because there's not much, from their opinion, it's not enough safety measures taken, like pylons should be used, for example. Then, as Jeremy has already addressed, we also found that the planning process, how it was perceived as justice or fair, did have an impact on the attitude. That is, whether the offshore wind farms were opposed or were accepted. And what we see is that all over the perceived amount of justice and fairness was rather low throughout all the regions where the wind farms had been built. And it was highest in this area in the middle of Norderney, and that's already something that Jeremy has addressed as well. Here the cable was coming onto land, and here in this case of this island, they had a very positive negotiation with the developer of the wind farm, and they got for them very acceptable compensations, and as well it was very well integrated into their tourism scale. That is, the cable development was not in the main season of tourism, so that was very important to them. And in the Baltic region at the DAS on the very right side, there was a lot of frustrations because here people thought that it would be possible to really have an influence on how the wind farms would be designed, the far shore as well as the near shore, but in the end they had to understand that nothing that they wanted to give in or wanted to have changed would be realized. That was their perspective. We also spoke to the developers, and they were frustrated as well because they thought they had done so many things but had not reached the people. And I think that's something to discuss about how to design participative processes, and it's also collected to a lot of range of legal admissions and restrictions, etc. But I would just want to draw your attention to this very important planning process, and we find the same onshore, just to say so. And another very important point was the tourism. As I said before, these are touristic areas. And what we see here is that in the beginning, in 2009, people were on average concerning the non-visible far shore more neutral, but the near shore that were sometimes visible were evaluated less positively. That is, they feared that it would have a negative impact on tourism. And what you can see is that from 2009 to 2011 here in the North Sea region, we didn't find a significant change, but we did so in the Baltic Sea region, and that was from a rather slightly negative, it became neutral. So the residents experienced that it did not have an impact on tourism from their subjective perception. And now we come to, for this research, we come to the last slide. And this is, we talked to the tourists, and so we also checked for the objective booking numbers in this region. We had one tourism expert in our team. And also the objective impact of on tourism was not found. That is, everything was booked out despite the wind farms. And people also said, when we asked them, are you going to make holidays again in this region? Most of them would agree to do so, and their choice was not related to the offshore wind farms or they could observe in that region. And it should also be noted now that we did another survey in this region of the DAS and the Baltic region now just 2 years ago, and there we found a little different picture. Still, the tourists said, no, it's not a problem, but there were a lot of discussions because wind turbines a little closer to the shore were discussed to be built, and there we had some very interesting discussions going on. But we don't have the time to go deeper into this, and I would try to draw a very first conclusion, and I just hope I have time to just dive into very briefly into the planning process. And the conclusion is, as you see, we have this consistent finding that visible near shore are less preferred to far shore, and we did not find the tourism like also Jeremy impact, like also Jeremy already talked about, and that the planning process is so very important. And it seems from the experience we did have also from other processes that we need different instruments to more integrate citizens, for, most of all a larger variety of community members, that is the younger ones, for example. And we had the chance to do a second research, and there have just the focus on this designing of wind farms and the impact on acceptance. And so there we had the chance with the ETH Zurich to build up this dome. It's a kind of cinema. You can see here that we transported to the touristic areas. And people, of course, were rather interested to have a look inside. And this is how it looked inside. So it's a 180-degree large screen, and it feels like you're just standing there at the coast. And we presented different designs that, as Jeremy already had pointed out, we had a meaning to the landscape. That is, we had different designs with different meanings connected to the landscape, and we were interested whether the different design would make a difference on the acceptance of tourists and residents. And just keep in mind, all these designs were realistic. All of them could have been built. And as time is running out, I don't have designs presented here, but what we did find was that the residents and tourists really did have preferences for different designs, and as you would expect, the local identity and the local characteristics, when they were matched by the offshore wind farms, the designs were more liked or more accepted. And also visualization is crucial, as Jeremy again has pointed out before. And in discussing this with the experts, with the planners who are in the authorities who are in charge of the planning process, they said it's very hard for them in the very early stage to give any visualizations, because at that time the farm is not really, how do you say that? It's not ready to be planned. And the first, more the restrictions have to be discussed, etc. But for the opponents, this doesn't matter. So they just did visualizations that were rather shocking and that really did have a rather large impact in the coastal line discussions of the residents about these wind farms. So it's very crucial also to have scenarios, and at the very beginning, in a very early stage of the planning process, although it's not clear how the farms will really look like, later on. So at least from the German perspective, this means we would have to have some changes in the planning, in the legal planning procedures. So it's a lot of things that can be done, and overall, to conclude, we see, like Jeremy presented for the US, rather positive attitudes, at least from tourists and most of the residents living at the coast, for not too visible offshore wind farms. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks, Gundula. So a quick reminder to all participants that if you have questions at any point, you can type them into the chat window that says participant feedback. This might be in the lower left corner of your screen. And we'll be monitoring those questions, and we'll host a Q&A session at the end of the 4 presentations. So next we have Patrick Devine-Wright from the UK. Here, take it away, Patrick.
Thanks, Joe. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, can hear you just fine.
Right, okay. Well, afternoon, everybody, if that's the right thing to say, from Exeter here in the southwest of the UK. And just like the other presenters, I'd like to acknowledge the thanks for Joe and Suzanne for helping to put this on, and for the other presenters for joining us today in this webinar on acceptance and related to offshore wind. So what I'm going to talk about today is the kind of importance of location or place in as one part of the story around understanding community acceptance of offshore wind energy projects. So I'm going to tell you about a project which I'm going to acknowledge actually the contribution of a colleague of mine, Bauke Wiersma, who was a PhD student of mine who's now graduated, and he was intimately involved in driving this research forward. So Bauke is very important in this research. So if we could move on to the next slide, or is that for me to do, Joe? Oh yeah, great, okay. So just by way of a little bit of theoretical background here, so I think certainly coming back to the original literature on social acceptance some 10 to 15 years ago, there was a very strong focus upon the turbines, what color the turbines were, how high the turbines were, how much noise they emitted, etc. A lot of very kind of quasi-technical details which were then filtering through into the social science research that was emerging at the time. And I think I just want to emphasize today the kind of the where dimension or the locational dimension. And that's really fundamental to wind energy projects. And projects to me are what happens when a particular technology configuration then meets a particular place in the world, a location. And this fits in with some quite nice social science theorizing in disciplines such as geography. And it's also pertinent to a particular research design which uses case studies to get a really in-depth understanding of how particular projects play out in a place in the world at a particular moment in time. And from a more theoretical point of view, place is a concept which is a way of understanding how things happen and not really seeing locations as simple containers where social life happens, but actually part and parcel of debates and conflicts. And at least part of the story around understanding conflicts and support, I would say, around wind energy projects and offshore wind energy projects comes back to understanding what the sea means to people and what the coast means to people and what kind of activities or experiences or emotions people associate with those particular places, recognizing that that might be diverse for different groups of people and particular parts of the coast or particular parts of the sea. So if we could move on to the next slide. So taking that on board, you know, if we're interested in citing conflicts, I mean, the NIMBY concept has been quite widely used to understand that. And there is a backyard intimately associated with that, and I think Suzanne already referenced that. So there is something about connections and maybe a sense of ownership, maybe concerns about property values, which are intrinsic to this area and have been for a very long time. And Germany already signified the value of concepts such as place meanings, if not place attachments necessarily or place-related identities. But the meanings would be sets of beliefs or shared understandings about what the characteristics of certain locations are, and whether they're associated with tranquility, peacefulness, a pristine natural environment, or something that it's a little bit more developed already or a little bit more urbanized. And those kinds of understandings and those meanings have been found again and again in the social science research to be at least part of the explanation for why community acceptance can be a difficult thing to achieve. And sometimes you get a kind of a symbolic conflict between projects that are considered to be industrial, in inverted commas, like large-scale energy infrastructure projects like offshore wind farms, and then, in inverted commas, natural environments which they are often proposed to be sited in. That can impinge then on people's sense of place, and there's a nice quote here from Richard Stedman's work about the way in which people's collective action can be galvanized in response to that sense of threat, which I think ultimately comes back to that, to whether the meanings are being threatened or being challenged in some way by what the project is perceived to suggest. So having introduced some kind of more conceptual ideas, I'd just like to show a little bit of data, to share a little bit of data here today. If we can move on to the next slide. So I'm going to take you to a small island off in between basically the coast of the UK and the coast of France in Europe, and it's an island called Guernsey. It's part of a group of islands called the Channel Islands, and it's a relatively small island. It's got a population of just over 60,000, and it's not in the European Union. It's actually self-governing, but it's a British Crown dependency, which means that it's kind of part of the UK, but it has its own separate autonomous parliament. It uses the British currency, sterling, but at the same time has its own parliament and, as I said, makes its own decisions. In terms of its scale, it's relatively small, and that's important to mention because nowhere on this island are you really that far from the coast. And so being close to the sea is an important part of island life and culture. Similarly to the island Jeremy talked about, electricity generation and use is a very important issue on islands like this. This particular place, Guernsey, is connected to France using an undersea power cable. It also has a power station in the northeast of the island which uses diesel for generation. And that is fairly expensive, but it's also quite polluting from a carbon point of view and a climate change point of view. The cable supplies electricity from France, as I mentioned, but it is prone to problems. And when there's an outage with that cable, they really are stuck on the island. They have to rely upon the diesel generator only, and that makes it obviously more difficult, more costly for people on the island. So one of the interesting things that's part of this research is the idea of self-sufficiency and autonomy and vulnerability, and whether offshore wind can play a role in relation to that. So the research I'm talking to you about took place before any technology was installed, so it's asking people hypothetically really about a potential future project. And the other important thing to say about this research was that it was really done in a very collaborative way with the policymakers on the island. They co-funded the research, and there were deep conversations all the way through about the research and the methods and what kind of questions should be asked. It was done in a pretty collaborative way. And the social science questions that were asked were building upon some technical assessments and natural science assessments that had already been commissioned by the government body there as to where would be suitable locations for wind projects to go in terms of seabed depth and connections to the grid and that kind of thing. So it was a social science extension of work that had already taken place. Okay, so if we could move on to the next slide. I'm having trouble scrolling, apologies, but this was a multi-method study, and I wanted to very briefly describe what we did at the start, which was to do an exploratory study using the qualitative method of in-depth interviews. But this was interesting because it had a visual component, which is sometimes called auto voice or photo elicitation. So during each interview, and there were 28 participants who were drawn from all over the island, the red dots on the island map on the top of the slide show the location of residence of the different participants. So we tried to sample residents in this phase of the research who lived in different locations in different parts of the coast. The green dots in the lower part of the slide reflect the locations of the photos that they brought themselves to the interview. And essentially they were asked to talk about what those places were, what meanings they had for them, why they might be important, and then only at a very later stage in the interview were they asked directly about offshore wind or offshore energy projects of various kinds. And I think the interesting thing about this kind of method is that it opens up very personal experiences and memories, and in a way that maybe is more difficult to achieve using methods such as questionnaire surveys. So if you look at the photographs on the top, we have somebody who is had taken a photograph of their feet sticking out of the water, going for a swim at sunset. And in the interview they were talking about the sense of solitude and escape and the sense of tranquility that was upon them in that kind of environment, swimming in the sea and feeling part of that natural environment. Whereas by contrast, the photograph below of one of the participants with her children reflects a particular bench on the coast where they go every Christmas Day. And so this is a ritual that they have as a family, and they do this every single year on this day, no matter what the weather, whether it's raining or windy or sunny or whatever. So it's a very important place for them to go to. So we collected these various place meanings in relation to specific parts of the island, and then moved on to ask about, for example, what they might feel about an offshore wind farm going in to places off the coast, and began to draw very preliminary maps, as you can see in the bottom right of that screen, about a kind of quasi-quantitative indicator of whether people would express a negativity in terms of the red numbers, -1 to -4, or positive feelings, +1 and above, as to where they might consider to be suitable locations to put an offshore wind farm. And to the east of Ireland, where that -4 is where the main centre of location is, called St. Petersport. And to the north of the island, +6 and +4, you've got indicators where maybe people thought that it was a better location, and that was interesting for us at this stage of the research, because that's where the island's landfill dump is already, and that's where the diesel power plant is already. So there's already a beginning of a sense that that part of the island is considered to be at least more industrialized than the rest, and less natural, which we found ultimately to be relevant in understanding their views. So if we could move on to the next slide, please. Again, I won't spend long on this, but just to reference the kind of cultural proximity that people have with the sea and what this means. So on Guernsey, there is a cultural practice which is called Ormering, and it happens only when you've got very low tidal levels and people are able to walk out onto the rocks over the seaweed, and there they go collecting a particular kind of snail, a sea snail or a sea creature called the ormer, which they take away and cultivate and eat, and they've been doing this for centuries. So I'm emphasizing this here just to say that the sea is something that isn't just something that people look at, but it's something that people do things in, and it's a cultural thing, not just an individual thing. It's part of what it is to be an islander and to live in this context and to avail of the sea as a resource around them. So what we then went on to do, and it's in the next slide, is to do some questionnaire survey research with a larger sample, attempting to reach out to a representative group of local residents. We reached nearly 500 in the end, and we used various methods to collect the data, but we were interested in what they thought about different locations that the government considered to be at least potential locations for offshore wind. So if you look at this map, you have Area A, Area B, and Area C. These areas are roughly the same distance offshore, 4 or 5 miles, so they're very visible, but they're areas of relatively low seabeds to make an offshore wind farm feasible, technically feasible. And some information was provided to the participants about how many turbines might be there, and we asked their views about what kind of place meanings were associated with the coast near there, and their views about projects. And we asked about acceptance in 2 ways, whether people would support wind farms in each of the 3 zones or accept wind farms in each of the 3 zones. And the information that we used here about a 10-turbine wind farm in the locations, as I said, we didn't make that up. That came from the collaboration with the island policymakers, because they were the ones driving where they thought might be the most appropriate locations to go, and then we were trying to find out to what extent there would be levels of acceptability of those different places. So if we move on to the next slide, I mean, I think what we're able to show here and you can judge yourselves whether this is an earth-shattering finding or common sense, that the same project with exactly the same technical specifications in terms of numbers of turbines and the ownership structure, which I haven't mentioned but I can go into afterwards, is actually experienced differently by groups of people. So if we look at the numbers here, these are just descriptive stats in terms of proportion in favor, proportion against, and red being against and green being in favor. So you can see that Zone C was significantly more considered more positive as a potential location for an offshore wind farm than Zone B, and Zone B was considered to be more preferential than Zone A. So there's a clear kind of hierarchy here in terms of what was considered to be a suitable location to put a wind farm of this kind. And if we look at the mean levels, and I understand that that masks diversity, but you can see that it was a mean of 2.48 for Zone A and a mean of 3.07 for Zone C. And I would just say at this point that it's worth mentioning that the policymakers were very nervous about any propositions for wind energy, because wind farms have been strongly contested in the UK, particularly onshore, but sometimes offshore as well. And one of the big learnings of this project in terms of our collaboration with the policymakers was a sense that they came away thinking, well, actually, you know, there might be locations where people might accept this, and they hadn't assumed that at all beforehand. So there is a direct benefit in terms of feeding into policy and potential planning decisions further on in terms of where they designate as being suitable sites for commercial developers to potentially work with. If we move on to the next slide, and I'm nearly done here, this still leaves open the question as to exactly why the different locations were perceived in different ways, some more preferable than others, and there's different parts to this story. Part of this is definitely about place meanings, and in here I think our results are consistent with the results which Jeremy talked about a few minutes ago. So we found that a consistent, significant predictor of acceptance in all three cases was whether that particular location, the coast, was considered to be a very natural, pristine environment, or it was considered to be already industrialized to some degree. And those effects had predictable direction. So the more natural the coast was perceived to be, the more opposed to the project people were, and the more industrialized it was already perceived to be, the more supportive people were expected to be. But those coastal meanings, whilst being significant, were not the most important predictor, and this was something that was a bit of a surprise that came out of the research. So we asked some questions in the survey about using a local resource to generate electricity for the island, so the island would have its own electricity supply from a locally available resource, unlike the diesel they use at the moment, which is imported, or the electricity that's imported from France. So we had a couple of items on this which came out as a separate factor in a factor analysis, and when these items were pooled together, they came out as being very important in terms of signalling the acceptance of potential wind farms off the island coast. So just to move on to the conclusions, I think the research shows that coastal locations where offshore wind farms might be proposed, they have great personal significance for some people. They're associated with lots of memories and activities and social activities and cultural activities, which then in turn can play a role in influencing whether they think that is a suitable place for an offshore wind farm to be sited or not. I think the results show the benefit of using different kinds of methods, verbal methods, visual methods, qualitative methods and quantitative methods, each of which have different strengths and different weaknesses in pulling out different parts of the story. I think on the particular issue of the explanatory variables here, I think for us it created a connection between areas of literature that are not often brought together, and I'm principally thinking about energy security and social acceptance. So energy security is often thought about at the national level in terms of where fuel supplies come from, but that has a particular resonance in island contexts which may be associated with vulnerability, and renewable energy and offshore wind in those contexts can be supported because they lend themselves to greater autonomy and may be seen to minimize vulnerability on the island. Now, you might think, well, what relevance has this research got for anywhere else, which might not be an island context? But I think as we move more and more towards, for example, more decentralized smart energy grids and more local or regional autonomy in electricity generation, supply and demand and storage, it might be that these issues around local autonomy as provided by new renewable energy projects comes into being as being a more and more important issue to take into account when we think about social acceptance considerations, where traditionally we would have been interested in maybe some of the things we've already heard about in terms of procedural justice and planning issues and visual impacts and noise impacts. So these broader issues about reinforcing autonomy or resilience at a local or regional scale might be important as well. And finally, I just think the research shows the value of doing collaborative work with island or local-based policymakers and practitioners who can inform the design of survey questions and the particular locations to be researched. And then in turn, the research can feed back into the policy-making process and inform where actual projects might be proposed or trajectories of future development. So I'd just like to finish there and thank everybody for your attention, and we'll move on. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Patrick. That was terrific. So we do have one more presenter, and I just want to make a quick note to all the participants that we're nearing the top of the hour, and the next presentation is pre-recorded since the speaker is from Japan and it's nearing 1 o'clock in the morning there, so we went ahead and pre-recorded as a video. And that recording is about 15 minutes long, so we will be going a little bit past the top of the hour here. But I do invite those who are able to stick around and join us for a question and answer period after that. So we might end up going till 1/4 past the hour or a little bit beyond that. For those who are not able to stick around, just a reminder that the webinar is being recorded, and we will make that available on the Task 28 website. And I'll also email all the registered participants with a link when that is available. So with that, I'm going to share the presentation from Yasushi Maruyama from Japan.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yasushi Maruyama. I'm environmental sociologist at Nagoya University. My research topic is renewable energy and social consensus, risk communication, and a business model. And today I would like to talk about the benefit sharing idea of offshore wind farm with the fishery community. Yet, for beginning, I'd like to introduce the status of offshore wind in Japan. Yeah, there is still not huge. We have 4 projects, experimental project, and we don't have big commercial projects still. But there are waiting a lot of huge wind farm projects, and especially offshore and far shore projects. And the challenge for offshore wind projects is we have legal framework, environmental impact assessment, the stakeholder management, and the strong pressure for cost efficiency. And the legal framework was it's the kind of bottom-up approach organized by a prefecture, and the national government authorized the process. And the prefecture hold a stakeholder conference, for example, community and the local government and the fisher association, and sometimes military, nature, NGO, and something. And with the consensus of stakeholders, the prefecture start proceed tendering process, looking at stable, secure, and cost-effective plan. And the second issue is environmental impact assessment. Of course, there are a lot of things to be sure. For the environmental, but this is not the topic for today. And the one of the biggest issue is the stakeholder management. And compared to onshore wind farm, stakeholder management is easy. At one side easier, but very, very complicated, and especially in Japan. And there are a lot of fishery village, and fishing is one of the main primal industry in Japan. So the problem is we have very strong fishery right in the nearshore. Usually, the local village have their own property and to fish, and in the far shore, we don't have specific fishery village, but it is licensing. So theoretically, every fisher can go into the area and fish. So it is not easy to fix who is stakeholder and who to fix, who to negotiate. So offshore wind farm tend to cost very expensive, but there is strong pressure for cost efficiency. So therefore, it is not easy to pay money pay money for fisher as the kind of compensation or land use or something. So with this background, Japan, there is a discussion to create a fishery co-benefit model for offshore wind farm. And this is one example of a research institute for ocean economics, and they shared some interesting idea about the future cooperative or co-benefit business model. And one of the characteristics of a wind farm, offshore wind farm, is they can easily collaborate with fishery. And this is the idea about the co-benefit, and the idea of, for example, artificial fishery or real-time monitoring for weather, temperature, current, or something. And this is the idea of artificial fishery reef. And sometimes they put these objects to attract fish and come into the area, so that fishermen can fish more than before the construction. And there is a test. This is the monitoring result of monitoring of one offshore wind farm pilot project, and the monitoring says they have effect to make up new ecosystem and it attract fish. And also there is an idea to build a aquaculture facility. Use the basement or jacket type of basement for aquaculture facility. yeah, there is also a test site in Hokkaido, and they nourish now seagrass. And also, this is the idea of the idea of aquaculture facility. Yeah, like this. Yeah, this is the aquaculture facility with the floating type. And also, also this is the idea of poaching prevention watch. Offshore wind farm needs internet infrastructure anyway. So there is an idea to use this network infrastructure for watching system for poaching or monitoring the condition of fishery area. Yeah, yeah. This is the idea. Yeah, like the idea like this, and yeah, we can summarize this the one possibility of co-benefit for fishery. One is creation of fishing ground. Potential protection of culture of fishery resources, aquaculture, fishing reef, and also the data collection or information service is also also one idea, or sightseeing or recreation. In the near shore, the income of fishermen is leisure fish. Sometimes they depends on leisure fishing, so recreational fishery. So to develop fishing park or wind farm cruise or diving spot is also our idea to boost the economy of fishery village. The electricity supply is also idea because the fishery is energy consuming industry with the fishing boats, or they have some fishery village have big ice plant. And so ice plant and a marine product factory. So so the idea is to provide electricity with them. Participation is not only maintenance of construction, but also the finance or equity is also ideal. Wind farm is also used for disaster prevention. And also one idea should be community fund, not only local community development, but also it would be required for resource management, because now the fishery is facing a problem of resource crisis, aroused by various reasons like overfishing or climate change or change of current. So one of the methods is to reduce fishing, but for reduced fishing, they need some guarantee or insurance for income. So the part of income from offshore wind farm can be used this kind of this kind of guarantee through the community fund. And this is the summary. This is the result of IDEA, community co-benefit mapping, which is used in the zoning program of one fisher village, and they put stakeholder, the fishery and the local community in general, and also time scale to from planning and construction to operation. Okay, I'd like to conclude with my presentation with the idea that the distribution issue is now very serious, but it can be solved by indirect benefits like the program I showed today, and this is also these projects are cost effective, and also with the social acceptance, we have to focus more on the variety of stakeholders, and not only fisherman is one of the very specific stakeholder, but there are various stakeholders behind, and so to translate wind farm projects to the local community or local sustainable development, we need a local mediator, and this will be the future work. Thank you.
And a big thanks to Yasushi for sharing his slides too. And I guess at this point I'll transition into the Q&A, but before I do so, I would like to thank all the presenters, researchers for doing just an amazing job summarizing these complex research projects in a really short time format. I think we easily could have talked about each of these projects for hours individually, but at least we gave a good background here, and folks on the webinar now have some names of researchers to reach out to, and hopefully kind of a bit of a flavor of the type of research going on offshore wind energy social acceptance around the world. So with that, let's transition into the Q&A, and as I said before, please do type in any questions you have into the chat window, and we'll be monitoring those and asking questions as they come in. But to start off, we do have a few questions here. So one came in for Gundula. Just a quick question, Gundula. Are you aware of these visualization booths in the US or anywhere else in the world, or is the one in Germany really unique and the only one in existence?
Well, this dome is very unique, and it's not only unique in Germany, but there's just one, and that's now in the laboratory in Switzerland. And it appeared that it takes 1 day to set it up and 1 day to set it down. So there were some restrictions that we experienced, but still, I think from our experience, it's a very interesting setup of a visualization possibility, because you go inside this room and it's like you are in the real surroundings, and it did have a very positive impact on the discussions that were going on. And many things more to tell about this, but I shall give a short answer. But what we did was we could also change the light. We could change the day of time. We could change the view, how far you could see into the ocean, etc. And people said that was most interesting to them, to have the opportunity to experience it in such a different variety of atmospheres.
Great. Thanks, Gundula. So this question is really for everyone, all the presenters. And the question is, do you all believe that offshore wind development will, and I'm quoting the questioner here, will save wind power's potential contribution. And by that, the questionnaire means, will offshore wind be a preferred mode of development so as to assuage objections to onshore projects? And I invite any of the speakers to offer their insights on that.
Hi, this is Jeremy. I guess in the U.S., I think we're such a big place, and I think ultimately all solutions are local. And so on the East Coast, we don't have very good land-based wind resources, and so we haven't tried to exploit what little we have, and so we've moved offshore. I don't think it's going to substitute for land-based wind in the center of the United States. So ultimately, I mean, we don't even have a one connected grid in the U.S. We have 3 grids. So ultimately, all solutions are local.
Can I come in, Jeremy, at this stage?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, Mike, and I think that to me, in a way, as interesting as whether wind energy goes offshore or onshore is, what is the scale of deployment and who's leading on it and who's benefiting from it. And I think part of the problem with the debate on the value of wind energy and broader energy transitions is that those nuances of ownership and scale tend to get lost. And the default tends to be the assumption that these have to be very large-scale commercial developments, which of course have huge visual impacts then. And I think that if we are completely stuck with a development model which has to be very large in scale and led by commercial enterprises, then you will probably be right in your answer that offshore will be the saving of the sector. But I'd like to think that other kinds of organizations, like more community-based groups, like was a bit more common in Denmark in the original development of the industry, with farmers coming together in cooperative structures, I still would like to think that there's a role for them in renewable energy transitions onshore. But I think large-scale commercial developments onshore are a different kettle of fish. But as Jeremy has just said, it's really it's very difficult to generalize, and different countries have different profiles in terms of settlements and dispersal, and the UK and England in particular has got a fairly concentrated settlement pattern, whereas in the United States maybe there's more openness to very large scale developments that are still quite far away from residential developments.
Well, this is Gundula, if I may add, that well, I think that when we talk about real far shore that is not visible, then you might say that there won't be larger problems as long as the nature preservation needs are met. But if it's visible and closer to the shore, I think we will have the same developments that Patrick has just been talking about. And so I think it's not just the way to say, okay, we go offshore. This will not solve all problems, but it's really the broader perspective about how you develop society. It's about social change and changing of our energy system.
Okay, thanks you all. So we have a question specifically for Gundula. What is your view of innovative citizen instruments, and who should be responsible for carrying this out and funding this? And would this delay planning and deployment of offshore wind?
Well, we talked about this with practitioners in the project that we did together with the Ministry of Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, the north part of Germany. And this was exactly the questions that we discussed. And what they said is, and that's what I tried to address when I said it has to be scenario visualizations in the early beginning. So they said that's something that might be very helpful, that you start with scenarios just in a very early beginning, and just, of course, make clear that these are not the layouts that will be built later. But if you don't do this, then the people who are less, say, bonded to physical features, they might just take over and make very crazy visualizations, as happened in that area, and that will influence other people who are uncertain, and that might create more opposition, and that will result in longer planning processes. But another point is that talking about innovative methods, that in this dome we had the ETH managed to realize that on spot you could change the design of this wind farm, and also always including the restrictions that have to be met to have a realistic planning design. So if you can do so, that you have the possibility to stay to the restrictions and discuss at the moment with the people, you can discuss what would happen if we put, let's say, 5 wind turbines a little farther north or south. How large would be the impact on the energy efficiency? How would be the impact on the visibility? And you could show this at the moment with these visualizations. I think that would really be helpful. At least that's what the planning experts said. So they said this might even shorten the process. And another point is that, we're talking now about informal participative processes, at least from the German perspective. And the question is how you could integrate these informal processes into the later formal admission process, especially now that we have the development that you have competitive bids. And so another question is how can you integrate what we've talked about, all of us talked about the meaning of changing of the landscape, the local identity connected to wind turbines, etc. How can you bring this in when you're just thinking about the large-scale commercial necessities that are behind all this offshore and onshore business? So that's also what Patrick has talked about. How can we integrate this? I think that's another very important point. But to sum up, yes, I think you can have an improvement of planning by using interactive planning instruments connected to further factors. It's a broad topic, but I think everybody who's online now knows about this.
Terrific. Thanks, Gundula. So I think maybe we'll take 2 more questions and try to wrap up at past. So the first question that we have here is really related to birds, and Suzanne just sent out via the chat window some information about IEA Task 34, which is focusing on environmental and wildlife impacts. So we direct the questionnaire to check out that task and search specifically for offshore impacts to wildlife via the findings from IEA Task 34. But I would ask the presenters here today if they have any comments relating to social opposition and how that might be affected by or whether it's different in terms of concerns for wildlife for offshore versus the onshore context. So are concerns kind of for wildlife diminished when we move into the offshore realm?
Hi, this is Jeremy. I wouldn't say that they're diminished. I would say they're different. So, but avian concerns are still quite large offshore, and you've got to be careful as to where you place it. And there are certainly concerns about bird movements during storm events. There's probably less concern about bats, but here in the U.S., much more so than in Europe, we've got large migrating whales. So, like Europe, we have dolphins and porpoises, and those are going to come into play in the context of the construction. But we also have endangered species, including the North Atlantic right whale, and those are certainly species of concern. I mean, indeed, they're charismatic megafauna, and so one might suppose that the issues may even be more concerning. As well, the avian community, there's a large recognition that the largest threats to birds are habitat destruction and climate. I do think that with offshore, because the projects are so large and maybe going one on top of the other, the bigger issue may be habitat displacement, because we see that birds mostly fly around them than they are with mortality.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Can I
go ahead, Gundula. Yeah.
Just very briefly. First, I agree with Jeremy, and we also have sea mammals, not so many, but we do have them, and they are top like birds. That's why I just like to draw your attention to the research of Alpha Ventus. You'll find the internet page on the last slide of my presentation. And Alpha Ventus has done a lot of research on the impact on wildlife, and this might be quite very important information. And again, for the residents, the maritime safety was most important, and then followed by the impact on the birds and the sea mammals.
Thanks, Gundula. And I just flipped over to show your last slide of your presentation, so folks can see that URL there. And the last note I'd like to make before we wrap up with the last question is just to thank the U.S. Department of Energy's Wind Energy Technologies Office for supporting the organization and facilitation of this webinar, that being largely my time and the time of Suzanne Tagan, my co-facilitator. So with that, let's move on to one last question that I think is a good way to wrap things up. And it says, we have wonderful findings from all this research, very interesting stuff, but how can it be implemented into politics and practice? So basically, how do we transition from the research that you all and other researchers are doing and implement into sustainable energy politics and practice? And moreover, how can we sustain funding for this type of research, including this international sharing of this knowledge like we've done today?
Hi, this is Jeremy again. I think first, Department of Energy here in the U.S. and other agencies have to begin to have a greater appreciation for the fact that we have a social issue that has technology components rather than a technology issue that's social components. So I think it requires a rethinking of government funders for these kinds of research. The offshore area is tricky because there's not a lot of local control. And we're often, here in the U.S. and certainly in Europe as well, we're pushed into these large environmental impact statements. Here we have NEPA, they have EIAs, and they're fairly inflexible as to what's required of both government and developers. And so I think states who are buying this power should take a larger role and both in engaging itself and in mandating that developers who they're going to buy power from engage in this kind of communication. Communities that are going to accept transmission should as well, and part of this should come with some funding. There are tremendous bonus payments paid to the federal government for these lease areas, and some of this should be ultimately transmitted. It would require a change in law, but like under our federal Superfund law, the Hazardous Waste Cleanup Law, where we fund local citizens and we help them have their own experts, and we can help cultivate citizen leadership. I think these are all sort of important things that can be done to try and get us out of the NEPA box, which is not all that helpful from an engagement standpoint. It works well as far as investigating all of the potential environmental impacts, but it doesn't do a lot to engage communities, to get community buy-in, to get community input, and to take that input seriously.
Thanks, Jeremy. And anything from the other two presenters today?
If I may continue, well, this question was from Christian, and Christian is from Denmark, and it's the pioneer country of wind energy, now meeting a lot of opposition. So I think this is a question that's also very large, a very strong challenge for everybody of us. And I think we need a lot of motivation and a lot of patience and have to continue. And from my experience, it's very helpful to work in a transdisciplinary team, because it's the practitioners who need the knowledge and who have to continue, especially people who are also in charge of administrative processes. But even then, it's very hard to bring the knowledge into politics. And I think we have this experience not only with wind energy, but also other topics. And I think an important way to go is to influence politics, and it's what we see at the moment, that the young people start to move, that the people become active, the young people become active. That's really something that's maybe helpful for the social change into the direction of renewable energies. And I think it's very important just to keep on making webinars like this and try to spread all the information again and again. And I don't know how to say it in English, but it's we say it in Latin. It's when a little drop when a little drop keeps on, then the stone will be broken sometime. So I think that's this principle that we might have to continue, and hopefully get more people who become active and try to make the transition of the energy system their own. And again, it has to be part of society and not only business.
Thanks, Gundula. That's wonderful. Patrick, anything to add?
Yeah, just briefly, a couple of things. One is that, as I trailed in my own presentation, there is a lot of value, I think, to energy social science in getting out of the university and trying to do research in a collaborative relationship with policymakers. And then I think that can enable implementation, in inverted commas, maybe a bit more likely to happen. I also think that academic social scientists need to get better at communicating their findings in outside of academic journal papers, which we're all brilliant at writing, or we all try anyway, at least, but not many people outside of the academic realm actually read, and that's why webinars of this kind are extremely useful as modes of communication with people from outside the academy. I think in terms of funding, the only thing I wanted to point out is that there is it's just to mention the Mistral project, which some of us on the call are involved in. Christian is involved in for sure anyway, and it's a European Union funded project about social acceptance of wind energy and renewable energy, and it's a great example where academics come together and on an international basis and put together a research program around social acceptance that can really have reach and impact. And I think we have to kind of take those kind of opportunities for collaborative research across national boundaries as much as possible, and keep looking out for them and keep submitting proposals. So yeah, I think there's plenty to be done, but also there's a lot to be gained.
And Joe, this is Suzanne. Can I add one thing?
Yes, please, Suzanne, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, I also really appreciate all of the speakers' time, and you you really condensed your research so that we all have a taste of it now. And as we move forward with transitioning globally to clean energy, and we're really transitioning away from the older sources to the newer sources, I think around the world, we don't have everybody represented here obviously today, but in Asia there is a lot of new offshore wind happening. The most offshore wind installations last year in 2018 were in China. So as we transition, and we have countries like China and then India and Africa, and we have newer clean energy sources, I think this issue of social acceptance and community acceptance is going to just grow and be more and more important. And as I was saying in the beginning, as we get closer to people and build out, and there are going to be more people, and there will be more installations of power, of energy sources, this issue becomes more important, that it's also accepted so that we can have these important installations, deployments of clean energy. So I wanted to just thank all of the researchers again for doing such important work in this area and sharing it with us.
Thanks, Suzanne. I think that's a great note to end on. So thanks again to all the presenters and to all the participants. Thank you for joining, and please feel free to follow up with any of us at any time. And have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.